The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made it impossible to tell if it was midnight or noon. Elena Martinez had stopped noticing the hum 3 years ago. Her badge hung from a lanyard printed with cartoon cats, a gift from a patient's daughter, and she clipped it to her scrub pocket with the same mechanical precision she applied to everything else: smooth, efficient, invisible. The night shift at St. Michael's Hospital began at 11 p.m., and by 11:56, Elena had already started 2 4s, charted 3 patient updates, and restocked the trauma bay without anyone asking her to do it. She moved through the corridors like a ghost in blue scrubs, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum. The ER night shift was quiet on Wednesdays. Quiet was good. Quiet meant she could work. Dr. Marcus Mercer arrived at 12:15 a.m., which meant he wasn't supposed to be here. He was the chief of emergency medicine, a man whose business card probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent, and his presence in the ER at this hour was the kind of thing that made junior residents suddenly find urgent business in the supply closet. He stood at the nurse's station with his arms crossed, designer watch catching the light, studying the room the way a general studies a battlefield that should already be his. Elena didn't look up from her charting. She had learned long ago that the less she existed when Mercer was around, the better. Martinez. Not a greeting. An identification tag. Patient in Bay 3. 62-year-old male, acute coronary syndrome presentation, arrived via ambulance 12 minutes ago. Status. She closed her chart without rushing. Stable. Troponin pending. EKG shows anterior wall involvement. He's on aspirin, heparin drip running at 1,000 units per hour, for nitroglycerine available. Cardiology is 8 minutes out. Mercer's jaw tightened. Not because she was wrong, she was never wrong about the medical details, but because she had answered his question with the kind of precision that made it clear she didn't need him to tell her how to do her job. He had spent 23 years climbing toward authority, and somewhere along the way, authority had become the only thing that mattered to him. He walked to Bay 3 anyway, his pressed white coat moving like a sail. Elena watched him go, her face blank as water, then returned to her documentation. What Mercer didn't see was the way her hands moved. They didn't shake. They never shook. A normal nurse, a nurse who had learned medicine in a classroom rather than in a bombed-out clinic in Fallujah with mortar rounds impacting the courtyard, would have some tremor during an acute MI. Adrenaline. Fear. The weight of responsibility. Elena's hands were steady as a surgical laser. The muscle memory was older than her nursing degree. 14 years older. The night shift continued its quiet rhythm. At 1:33 a.m., a woman came in with a badly lacerated hand from a kitchen accident, and one of the paramedics, a guy named Rodriguez who had been running calls for 6 years, asked Elena to handle the repair. Not because she was the most senior person working. Because she was the best at it. His voice had a certain tone when he asked her, respectful. The tone usually reserved for people with titles and credentials hanging on walls. Mercer noticed this too. He was standing near the trauma bay when Rodriguez made the request, and Elena saw something flicker across his expression like a light switch being flipped the wrong way. She sutured the hand with 12 precise stitches, each one exactly 3 millimeters apart, pulling the skin edges together like she was solving an equation that had only one correct answer. The woman watched in fascination. "You're really good at this," she said. "How long have you been nursing?" Elena tied off the final stitch with a technique that had a name in the military but not in civilian textbooks. "Long enough," she said quietly. At 2:33 a.m., the ER doors slid open with their pneumatic sigh, and paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a young man with fresh bandages across his abdomen and left shoulder. Staff Sergeant Tim Dawson, according to the paperwork. 24 years old. Shrapnel wound sustained during a patrol in Baghdad. He was pale but conscious, his jaw set in the particular way of men trained not to show pain. Elena walked him to Bay 7 and began the intake assessment: vitals, pain level, medication allergies, last time he ate. Routine. Professional. Her voice had that flat quality it always had, which was to say no quality at all, just the delivery mechanism for information. Dawson's eyes were tracking her movements, the way a predator's eyes track prey, except his prey was memory. He winced as she checked the dressing on his shoulder wound, and his gaze landed on his own arm. The tattoo. Block letters. Martinez. Black ink that had faded to something like gunmetal over the years. That's wild, he said, and there was actual laughter in his voice despite the pain. Your name? I got this when I was 21, dumb as a post. My buddy Marcus used to go by Martinez, hometown name, you know? Thought it was hilarious to get it tattooed. Thought I'd remember him every time I looked at it. He extended his arm so she could see it better. Never figured I'd actually meet someone with the same name working the night shift in Colorado Springs of all places. Elena looked at the tattoo. The ink. The skin beneath it that had been torn by shrapnel and healed under field dressings because there was no time for proper medical facilities, just the sound of helicopters and the smell of diesel fuel and hands that kept shaking until they learned not to. Her face remained neutral. Her pulse remained steady. These were not achievements. These were basic operational standards. It's a common name, she said. She attached the cardiac monitor, watching the display fill with the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. You're going to need imaging on that shoulder. I'll get the order in. Are you comfortable? Any nausea? Dawson seemed to expect something else, a moment of recognition, maybe, or a story about her own connection to the tattoo. Instead, he got a nurse doing her job. Professional distance. A raised temperature that polite people maintain between themselves and strangers. I'm good, he finally said. Just tired. Been a long day. Elena adjusted his fur line and stepped out of the bay, pulling the curtain behind her. In the supply room, where no one could see her face, where the rows of equipment and medications created the kind of silence that only exists when people are trained to move without making sound, she turned toward her locker. The jacket hung there, the one she'd worn when she arrived, the one she'd been wearing for 3 years. The lining was worn soft from handling. If anyone looked, really looked, they would see where something had been carefully sewn into the interior, stitched with the kind of precision that suggested medical training. A patch. Faded, a little frayed at the edges. 2 crossed lightning bolts and words in Latin, viribus unities. With valor. She didn't take the jacket out. She just looked at it for a moment, the way someone might look at a grave marker, acknowledging something that had to stay buried. The intercom crackled. Another admission. A 68-year-old with chest pain. Elena closed her locker and returned to the ER, her expression exactly the same as it had been before, present, competent, empty of any history that might complicate things. At the nurse's station, Dr. Mercer was reviewing the charts Elena had filled out for Dawson. His fingers drummed on the counter, tap, 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 the rhythm of someone whose mind was working through a problem that frustrated him. The problem was that every note she wrote was perfect. The problem was that the paramedics respected her. The problem was that somewhere in the quiet corridors of St. Michael's Hospital, a nurse in blue scrubs had established a quiet kind of authority that no amount of credentials could manufacture, and he couldn't understand how, which meant he couldn't control it, which meant he would have to fix it. His eyes narrowed as Elena moved past him toward the supply room, and that's when something shifted in the air. Not much. Just a pressure change, the way a room feels different when a predator has caught a scent. The night shift continued, but the hunt had begun. The conference room at St. Michael's held the particular silence of people pretending to take notes while actually watching blood in the water. 17 residents and 2 attending physicians sat in tiered seating, their eyes fixed on the projection screen where Dr. Mercer stood with the bearing of a man who had never been questioned in his life. He was 63, silver-haired, the kind of doctor whose nameplate included the letters Chief and whose office overlooked the Front Range. The kind of doctor who believed hierarchy was biology. Let's examine dangerous cowboy medicine, he announced, gesturing to the chart displayed behind him. A sepsis case. Pneumonia progressing to septic shock. The charting was neat, precise, the clinical reasoning laid out in blue ink annotations. Note the failure to follow our established sepsis protocol. Note these presumptuous diagnostic leaps. He tapped the screen with his laser pointer, a gesture meant to drive a nail. This is what happens when nursing staff attempt to practice medicine without the benefit of actual medical education. Elena sat 7 rows back, her hands folded on her lap, her face the kind of still that comes from knowing your own heartbeat better than your own name. She recognized the case immediately. 43-year-old male, admitted through the ER with community-acquired pneumonia, deteriorating across 72 hours. She had been the night shift nurse. She had caught the subtle progression, the skin cool and mottled, the mental status shifting from confusion to agitation, and had flagged sepsis before the attending even ordered labs. The charting on the screen was not hers. The handwriting was hers. The clinical reasoning was someone else's, rewritten to look reckless. Mercer's eyes found her across the room. A predator's eyes. Ms. Martinez, care to defend this creativity? The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical drone. Elena stood slowly, unhurried, and walked to the front of the room. Not defensive. Not explaining. She stepped sideways until the laser pointer's beam was a red dot on her shoulder, and she turned to face the doctor whose institutional power had just revealed itself as tissue thin. "Your insecurity is showing, Dr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was level, the kind of steady that comes from having been through worse things than performance reviews. The notes on that screen aren't charting. They're a character assassination. And everyone in this room knows it. She turned and walked toward the door. The click of its closing was the loudest sound the conference room would hear for 3 minutes. 3 days later, the break room vending machine hummed its low mechanical song. Elena stood in front of it, inserting bills into the slot with mechanical precision, surrounded by a small constellation of residents grabbing coffee before rounds. The break room smelled like old coffee, the acrid ghost of microwaved meals, antiseptic floor cleaner. It was a space designed for no one to feel comfortable, which was perhaps why Dr. Mercer chose it to enter, loud and performative, his voice pitched to carry. "Martinez, remind me," he called out, his tone bright with false curiosity. "Did you actually finish nursing school, or did you get one of those online certificates? I always forget which ones are legitimate." He turned to the residents with a smile that suggested he was simply being helpful. Laughter rippled through the group, the nervous kind, the kind that came from people unsure whether they were laughing at Elena or with the man who signed their evaluations. Elena turned from the vending machine. Her coffee cup was in her hand now. She held Mercer's stare for the duration it took the laughter to die, which was approximately 2 seconds. The silence that followed was the kind that made the air pressure feel different. "I finished top of my class," Elena said. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, instead, a half-octave lower. "You finished married to a board member's daughter and still can't score above the 45th percentile on your patient satisfaction surveys. We both know which credential matters more here." She turned back to the vending machine, retrieved her coffee, and walked past the residents without looking at any of them. The vending machine continued its mechanical hum. No one made eye contact with Mercer. By evening, the hospital had settled into its familiar rhythm. The ER ran like a well-oiled machine that occasionally caught fire, controlled chaos, practiced protocols, the kind of environment where you either trusted your team or you died trying. Elena was in trauma bay with an attending physician named Dr. Shelton, a woman who had been in emergency medicine for 19 years and still loved it with the intensity of people who hadn't yet learned to stop. They were moving a patient, motorcycle versus semi-truck. The truck had won, through initial assessment. Breath sounds diminished on the left, Elena said quietly, her hands already moving toward the portable ultrasound machine. She wasn't asking. She was informing. Hyperresonance at the second intercostal. "I'm reading tension pneumothorax, not pneumonia." Dr. Shelton turned to look at her, and in that moment, Dr. Mercer walked into the trauma bay like a man who had received a summons he didn't understand. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved directly to Elena. "If you practice medicine one more time," he said, stepping between Elena and the patient, "I'm calling security to escort you out of this hospital." "That's not a suggestion." Elena met his eyes for exactly 3 full seconds. Her jaw clenched, not from fear, but from the mechanical restraint of someone whose hands had learned long ago not to become fists when provoked. She did not step back. She did not defer. She simply waited. Dr. Shelton, recognizing the pathology in front of her, ordered the pericardiocentesis. A needle. A syringe. The anterior pericardial space. The release of 200 milliliters of fluid that had been compressing the heart. The patient's blood pressure climbed. His oxygen saturation improved. His lips went from gray to pink to their natural color. Elena had been right. The diagnosis was cardiac tamponade, not tension pneumothorax. The patient would live because Elena had spoken quietly enough that only the people in the room could hear her, which meant only the people who mattered would know. Mercer's face went the color of old brick. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked out, and Elena realized that she had just made a mistake. Not professionally, medically, she had been flawless. The mistake was personal. She had given him a wound that wouldn't close, and a man like Mercer didn't forget those. A man like Mercer made phone calls. 30 minutes later, Elena was in the locker room alone, standing at the sink with her hands gripping the ceramic edge. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. Not from anything as simple as adrenaline. The trembling was something else, the specific physical manifestation of restraint. Her entire body was a clenched fist holding something back, and the shaking was the sound of that effort. She ran cold water over her wrists, watching her reflection in the mirror. A woman in teal scrubs. A woman whose eyes had gone pale in the fluorescent light. A woman wearing a name tag that read, Elena Martinez, RN, and nothing else. In her locker, beneath her jacket, there was a fabric patch sewn carefully into the lining, a faded Special Forces unit insignia, colors worn almost to ghost. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She could feel it the way you feel scars under your skin. The night continued. The ER filled with a normal parade of human suffering, chest pain and head injuries, allergic reactions and dehydration, a man who had somehow impaled his foot with a metal rebar and still insisted he was fine. Elena moved through it all with the precision of someone for whom chaos was a known language. She started 2 large bore fours in a patient in cardiogenic shock. She talked down a psychiatric admission who was threatening to leave against medical advice. She changed the dressing on a surgical wound while the patient watched a cooking show and forgot to be afraid. And in his office on the 3rd floor, Dr. Mercer sat at his mahogany desk and made phone calls. The first was to a board member. The second was to the Colorado State Nursing Board. The third was to Human Resources, his voice measured, his documentation prepared. Dangerous cowboy medicine. Practicing beyond scope. Insubordination to a supervising physician. He had built 23 years of professional capital, and tonight he was going to spend it all on making one nurse disappear. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he didn't yet understand what Elena actually was. He thought he was dismantling a problem. He was actually waking something up. And in approximately 6 days, his entire institutional power structure would collapse in ways he couldn't yet imagine, because somewhere in Colorado Springs, a phone was about to ring, and on the other end would be the voice of someone Elena had saved in a place that officially didn't exist. The dispatch radio crackled at 14:24 on a Wednesday afternoon. Multi-vehicle pileup, I-25 northbound, milepost 142. 17 confirmed casualties. ETA 6 minutes. The ER transformed in the space of a breath. Trauma bays shifted from routine to orchestrated violence. Nurses moved in a synchronized choreography Elena had performed 1,000 times before, except those times, the sound of incoming fire echoed across a bombed-out clinic in a place that no longer existed on any official map. The first ambulance arrived with its sirens peeling the sky open. A man with a steering wheel imprinted on his chest. Elena was waiting, gloved hand steady, her presence like a lens focusing chaotic light into a single point. She didn't move faster than anyone else. She moved with intention. Purpose. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that human bodies can endure. Blood on tile. Oxygen masks. The sharp electric smell of ozone as the defibrillator charged for a patient whose rhythm had flatlined somewhere between exit 156 and the nearest hospital. She moved through the ER like she'd done this 1,000 times before, because she had, just in a different desert under different circumstances. The second ambulance brought a woman with crush injuries from the vehicle behind her, femur shattered, compartment syndrome developing in real time. Elena positioned herself at the bedside, her trauma shears cutting away the woman's jean leg with surgical precision. The metal blade snapped through fabric like gunshots in the silence between monitor beeps. No hesitation. No second guessing. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid certainty of someone who had performed field amputations under small arms fire. Blood loss at this rate, 45 minutes before shock. She marked the woman's abdomen with a felt pen, noting the exact time, the exact progression. Pain was data. Data was survival. The third ambulance brought chaos in human form, a teenager, 17 years old, eyes wide with the kind of fear that only comes when your lungs stop working properly. His oxygen saturation was 62 when he arrived. The air wasn't moving. His left side was silent to auscultation. Elena recognized the pattern before she saw the X-ray. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was compressing his mediastinum, collapsing the right side, crushing his heart. Without decompression, he would die in minutes. Not hours. Minutes. She was positioning her hands, locating the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, when Dr. Mercer arrived. He swept into the trauma bay with the authority of a man who had spent 23 years convinced that his title granted him truth. His eyes scanned the monitor, took in the saturation reading, still falling, now 58, and he reached for the needle decompression kit with the confidence of someone who had never failed at anything in his life. Elena didn't step back. She didn't yield. She simply continued her assessment, her fingers already finding the anatomical landmarks, already identifying the exact angle of approach. The teenager's lips were turning blue. His neck veins were distending like cords. She could feel his pulse accelerating, thready and weak, a rhythm collapsing under the weight of pressure it couldn't sustain. "Step back, Elena." Mercer's voice was smooth, assured, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I'll handle this." She didn't respond. She didn't acknowledge him. Her world had narrowed to a single point, the space between the second and third ribs, the exact position where she needed to insert the needle. Her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory. 15 years of it. The needle was 14 gauge, the kind that would whisper through flesh and fascia into the pleural space. She felt the resistance change as the needle penetrated the parietal pleura. One moment. That was all it took. The hiss of air escaping was audible across the entire trauma bay. A rush of pressurized nitrogen that had been crushing the teenager's heart suddenly decompressing into open atmosphere. The sound was like a sigh of relief from the patient's own body. Elena withdrew the needle, leaving the catheter in place, and within 8 seconds, the monitor began to shift. The saturation climbed. 64, 72. 81, the teenager's lips darkened from blue to pink. His eyes refocused. He gasped, actually gasped, as if he'd been drowning in air. Dr. Mercer's hands were still fumbling with the kit. His face remained composed, but something underneath had fractured. He looked at the catheter in place, at the climbing oxygen numbers on the monitor, at the teenager whose color was returning to something approaching human, and he stepped back. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't acknowledge her competence. He simply walked to the corner of the trauma bay and pulled his personal cell phone from his white coat pocket. Elena continued with the patient. Chest X-ray. Confirming placement. Securing the catheter with tape that would hold true against sweat and blood. The teenager was breathing now. Actually breathing. His eyes tracked toward her with the gratitude that only comes from being given back the function of your lungs. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, a gesture without words, the language of someone who understood that words were unnecessary when you were teaching a human body how to live again. But Mercer was already dialing. Elena heard fragments of the conversation, his voice low, his tone efficient, the careful phrasing of a man who was activating leverage. "Richard, it's Mercer. We need to talk about a personnel issue at St. Michael's. I have documentation." He paused, listening. "No, this one won't pass a board review. I'll send you the file. She's been practicing beyond her scope, making independent decisions, creating liability that the hospital can't absorb." Elena didn't acknowledge him. She didn't turn. She finished securing the teenagers monitored the chest X-ray technician positioning for confirmation imaging, and moved to the next crisis. An older woman with rib fractures and a pneumothorax that was developing slower, more insidiously. This one would need a chest tube. Elena already knew the procedure, the positioning, the exact angle of approach. She'd performed it under conditions far worse than a fully staffed Colorado Springs emergency room. Mercer made a second call. This one lasted longer. She heard him speaking to someone at the state nursing board, his words carefully chosen, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'm concerned about the credentials listed in Ms. Martinez's file. I'd like to verify her training. There are gaps in her employment history that trouble me." Another pause. "Yes, I'll send copies of her recent charting. I believe it demonstrates a pattern of independent decision-making that exceeds her scope of practice." The ER continued its organized violence around him. 3 more patients arrived. A child with internal bleeding. An older man with a cardiac event triggered by the adrenaline and trauma. A woman whose shoulder had been dislocated, now requiring reduction under sedation. Elena moved between them like someone conducting an orchestra only she could hear. The teenager with the pneumothorax, his saturation was now steady at 94%. His color was good. His breathing was controlled. He was going to live. Because Elena had moved 8 seconds faster than Dr. Mercer, 8 seconds that meant the difference between a funeral and a recovery room. By the time her shift ended at 11 p.m., Elena had triaged 17 patients, performed 2 chest tubes, assisted with 3 emergency reductions, and started 7 fours in patients with compromised vasculature. She'd done all of it while Dr. Mercer made 4 additional phone calls, each one another thread in a carefully woven tapestry of institutional destruction. Board members who owed him favors. Administrators who understood that his complaint was not a personal grievance but a warning about liability. An HR director who would begin reviewing Elena's file that very evening, noting the gaps, the inconsistencies, the way her references didn't quite align with standard nursing credentials. Elena hung her stethoscope on its hook. Removed her gloves. Washed her hands at the sink, watching the water run pink, then clear. She was thinking about Staff Sergeant Dawson, his eyes when he'd realized her name matched the tattoo on his arm. She was thinking about the teenager she'd just saved, about all the patients she'd pulled back from the edge of forever, about the fact that she could defend none of it without revealing the truth that the Pentagon had ordered her to bury. She didn't know yet. Not completely. But somewhere in the administrative machinery of Colorado Springs, something was already turning. Mercer had activated his network, the board members, the state licensing board, the HR apparatus that moved with the speed of bureaucracy but the certainty of institutional authority. In exactly 2 days, she would be escorted from the building by security. Her badge would be deactivated. Her locker would be emptied. She would become a ghost, removing herself from a hospital where she'd spent 8 years saving lives in silence. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't fight back. Not without exposing everything. Not without speaking the name Captain Elena Martinez aloud, not without mentioning Baghdad, not without admitting that she'd survived things that were supposed to kill her, that Black Ops extraction, those 5 rounds to the chest and abdomen, shielding a young corpsman while her body absorbed the impact that should have been his. She looked at her hands. Steady. Calloused. Marked with scars that told stories she could never tell. And then her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Check your email. Now. 2 days after the pileup, Elena was still wearing the same scrubs. She hadn't showered. Hadn't slept. Just sat at her kitchen table in Colorado Springs, in the small rented house on Cascade Avenue that she'd learned to call home, staring at the email on her laptop screen. The words blurred and refocused. Blurred and refocused. Concerning incidents of practice beyond the scope of licensure. Unauthorized assumption of physician-level decision-making. Insubordination and flagrant disregard for chain of command. Dr. Mercer had ceased everyone. The chief of nursing. The hospital administrator. The state board of nursing. Each name a closed fist. Elena's hands rested on the table, palms down. Steady. They didn't shake. Hands that had held a Marine's intestines inside his body didn't shake over words on a screen. But something in her chest had fractured, not visibly, the way Baghdad had fractured her ribs, but audibly, like thin ice cracking under a skate blade. The phone had rung that morning. 6:30 a.m. A woman's voice from Human Resources, professional and rehearsed. Ms. Martinez, we're going to need you to come in this afternoon for a meeting with security. Elena had already known. She'd felt it the moment Mercer made the phone call in the observation window above the trauma bay. She'd watched his fingers move against the glass, watched his lips form words, and she'd known that he'd finally found a way to use the system itself as a weapon. The meeting lasted 17 minutes. Security escorted her through the back corridors of St. Michael's, the ones the night shift staff used, away from the main ER traffic. Away from the people who might recognize her. Her badge was deactivated on the spot. She heard the electronic rejection when she tried to swipe out, the red light instead of green, the small mechanical denial that said you don't belong here anymore. Her locker was already empty. Everything boxed. Her jacket, the one with the faded Special Forces patch sewn carefully inside the lining, the one she'd worn for 18 years, the one that held the only physical proof of who she actually was, lay folded on top of the stack. Someone else had packed it. Someone else's hands had touched the fabric and had no idea what they were holding. The termination letter was printed on hospital letterhead. 3 pages. Legal language designed to sound neutral, but every word was a blade. Gross negligence. Unauthorized procedures. Violation of scope of practice. The state board had been alerted to conduct an independent investigation. She signed nothing. She didn't have to. They'd already signed for her, already made the decision before she walked in. The drive home took 12 minutes. Now she sat at the kitchen table, the termination papers spread in front of her like evidence at a crime scene. The laptop still glowed. The email from Dr. Mercer was still open, still real, still happening. She'd read it so many times the words had stopped making sense individually and became just shapes, black shapes on white paper, the same way screaming became just noise after a while. Elena couldn't defend herself. That was the trap Mercer had set and she'd walked directly into it. Any explanation of her medical knowledge would require explaining how she'd acquired it. Any defense of her competence would require producing records. Military records. Classified records. Records that officially didn't exist. The Pentagon had buried Captain Elena Martinez 18 years ago, had ordered her to disappear, had built an entire legal architecture designed to ensure that she could never, ever climb back out. If she spoke the truth, she'd violate her non-disclosure agreement. The one they'd made her sign in a basement office at Walter Reed, the one that threatened federal charges if she ever disclosed operational details. The one that had a clause, buried on page 4 in subsection C, that stated, any unauthorized disclosure of operational context, unit designation, or classified location information shall be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law, resulting in a minimum of 10 years federal imprisonment. They couldn't fire her for being too good. So they'd fired her for something else. Something she couldn't explain without proving they were right about everything else. The tears came without warning, not sobs but steady streams running down her face like rain on a windshield. She didn't wipe them away. She just let them fall onto the termination letter, watching the ink blur, watching her name disappear under water she'd produced herself. The front door opened. Sophia stood in the doorway, her small backpack still strapped to her shoulders, her second-grade uniform still perfectly creased. She was 8 years old and she had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's instinct for when something had broken. "Mommy, why are you home early?" The voice was small. Confused. The voice of a child who had never seen her mother cry before, who had been raised in a household where composure was oxygen, where strength was the only language spoken. Elena looked at her daughter and couldn't form words. Couldn't manufacture the lie. Couldn't say "I'm fine" or "just tired" or any of the 1,000 small deceptions that mothers use to protect their children from the weight of the real world. She opened her arms instead. Sophia dropped her backpack and ran across the kitchen tile, the sound of her sneakers sharp and alive. She climbed into Elena's lap with the unself-conscious trust of a child, and Elena held her, one hand on her small back, the other on her head, breathing in the smell of her strawberry shampoo and chalk dust and the irreplaceable scent of her own daughter. "Mommy's just having a hard day," Elena whispered into Sophia's hair. It wasn't a lie. It was the truth compressed down to a size a child could hold without breaking. Sophia's arms wrapped around Elena's neck. "It's okay, Mommy. You can have hard days." The restraint broke then, not in a sob, not in the way civilians understood crying. The kind of restraint that had held her together through 5 gunshot wounds. The kind that had kept her functioning while blood pooled in her abdomen. The kind that had never, in 18 years, actually broken. But it cracked. Just a little. Just enough to let some pressure out. They sat like that at the kitchen table, mother and daughter, surrounded by termination letters and unemployment forms and the wreckage of a life that had been systematically dismantled by a man who couldn't stand that she was competent. Elena's phone sat dark on the counter. She didn't know it yet, but 1 week would pass. 7 days of her sending out applications that would mysteriously be rejected, of nurses she'd worked with suddenly becoming unavailable, of the Colorado Springs medical community closing itself against her like an immune system rejecting a foreign body. 7 days of her wondering if this was how it ended, not in a helicopter extraction or a firefight, but in quiet bureaucratic destruction, in the slow suffocation of a life built on sand. 7 days before the call came that would change everything. But for now, there was only this, a mother holding her daughter, tears falling silently onto dark hair, the kind of heroism that no one saw and no one would ever know about. The kind that happened in small rented houses at kitchen tables while the world moved on. The kind that got broken by someone who couldn't bear to see excellence in someone else. 1 week after the parking lot rain stopped falling, Elena's phone rang at 2 in the afternoon while she was staring at unemployment forms spread across the kitchen table like a losing hand of cards. St. Michael's Hospital. The voice on the other end was desperate. "We need you. Critical patient in Trauma Bay 2. He's refusing treatment from anyone but the nurse with the steady hands." Those are his exact words. "We don't know what he means, but..." "I don't work there anymore," Elena said. I know what happened. I'm sorry. But this man won't let anyone touch him. His vitals are crashing. BP dropping, tachycardic, we need someone who can," the voice cracked. It was Dr. Hassan, the resident who'd watched her perform the needle decompression. The resident who'd seen Mercer try to take credit. "Please. Just come." The line went dead. Elena sat in the silence, her daughter Sophia at school, the afternoon sun cutting through the kitchen window in geometric shapes. 12 years of protocol. 18 months of living as a ghost. 3 days of unemployment that felt like 3 years. She grabbed her jacket without thinking. The faded Special Forces unit patch stitched inside the lining, the one she'd sewn there 7 years ago, pressed against her ribs as she moved. 22 minutes later, Elena walked through the ER entrance at St. Michael's. Her badge was gone, but her hands remembered the way. Her feet remembered the corridor. The smell of antiseptic and something darker, blood, probably, hit her like a physical thing, and her entire nervous system shifted. Not into fight mode. Into clarity. Trauma Bay 2 was controlled chaos. A man on the gurney, his face scarred in ways that mapped memories Elena had spent 18 months trying to forget. Baghdad, 2009. A bombed-out clinic on Almanara Street. 3 insurgents, one of them missing half his left ear, one of them with scars that ran from temple to jaw like lightning frozen on skin. The man on the gurney was that man. His eyes went wide when Elena stepped through the doorway. The monitor beside him beat frantically, heart rate 142, blood pressure dropping like a stone. Hemorrhagic shock. Somewhere on that scarred frame, bleeding was happening faster than her eyes could track. He whispered something in Arabic. 2 words. Al-Sadiqa al-Janubiyya. The Southern Saint. The room went dead silent. Dr. Hassan froze mid-procedure. A nurse with a trauma shear stopped cutting away fabric. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like they were protesting the weight of what had just been spoken. Elena moved past them without acknowledging anyone. Moved the way water moves around stone. Her hands already assessing, ABD exam, checking for distension, feeling for the source. There. Spleen laceration, maybe worse. The bleeding wasn't external. It was internal. He was drowning in his own blood. I need O negative, 2 units wide open, she said. Her voice had changed. Not higher. Lower. Thinner, somehow, like a knife edge. 14-gauge angiocath in both arms. Push wide open fluids. Type and cross for 4 more units. Nobody moved. She turned and looked at Dr. Hassan directly. Now. He moved. The trauma bay became coordinated motion. Elena's hands found the bleeding source. The spleen was shattered, had probably been shattered for hours in whatever altercation had brought him here. The angiocath needles went in smooth as practice. The fluid started running. His lips were white. His fingers were cold. Sinus rhythm, she said, reading the monitor. But he's losing consciousness. Get me a CBC, CMP, lactate. I need to know if he's got enough blood left to stay alive. A voice from the doorway cut through the controlled urgency. Nurse Martinez, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. You're not credentialed to. Staff Sergeant Tim Dawson stood in the trauma bay entrance wearing civilian clothes and an expression that looked like someone had just shown him the photograph of a ghost. In his right hand, a crumpled piece of paper. In his left hand, a walking stick made from hickory and wrapped in tan paracord. Don't finish that sentence, Doctor, Dawson said. His voice had the texture of gravel and broken glass. Not another word. He walked into the trauma bay, and every instinct in the room recognized what was coming. He was moving the way trained men move when they've made a decision. He unfolded the crumpled paper with one hand, and even with the tremor that came from 3 years of physical therapy, from surgeries, from learning to trust his body again, his voice was steady. Citation for extraordinary valor, presented to Captain Elena Martinez. Date of action, September 17, 2009. Location, Baghdad, Mansa District. In recognition of sustained personal bravery under extreme fire while defending medical personnel. He paused. His eyes were wet. Sustained 5 gunshot wounds while maintaining treatment of personnel under her care. 5 shots. Center mass and extremity. And she kept working. Kept her hand steady. Kept me alive. Dr. Hassan made a sound like something was breaking inside him. The man on the gurney, the scarred man with the lightning-burned face, reached out from the gurney and took Elena's hand. His grip was weak, but intentional. In Arabic, he whispered something that only she could hear. An apology. A benediction. A man who'd tried to kill her once, now bleeding out in her hands, asking forgiveness in the language of the place where everything had happened. The doorway filled with shadow. A man in civilian clothes entered the trauma bay. Silver hair, face lined like a topographic map of difficult decisions. 2-star generals bearing, though he wore no uniform. Elena recognized him before her mind fully processed it. General Malcolm Kincaid. 2004 to 2009. Her commanding officer. The man who'd signed the orders that erased Captain Elena Martinez from existence. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he moved his right hand from his side, formed a fist, and struck it against his chest directly over his heart. Once. A salute that said, "I know who you are. I know what you did. I know what it cost." "Bronze Star," he said quietly. "Purple Heart. Purple Heart again. Navy Commendation with Valor device." Behind him, a woman in administrative dress appeared with a burgundy box made of velvet and silence. Inside, medals that had been waiting. Just waiting. "Captain," General Kincaid said. 7 words. 7 words that brought her entire identity flooding back like a door opening onto a room she'd sealed off for 18 months. Another voice cut through the moment. "Excuse me, but protocol clearly states." Dr. James Mercer. Standing in the doorway. Sweat across his upper lip. Eyes darting from the general to Elena to the man on the gurney who was now receiving 2 units of O-negative blood running wide open, his pressure starting to climb, 85/50, 87/52, climbing back toward human territory. Mercer opened his mouth to continue. General Kincaid turned his head slowly, and whatever expression moved across his face made Mercer's knees buckle. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. He just looked at the man, and the man understood that his career had just collapsed like a building losing its foundation. Mercer ran. Actually ran. Down the corridor, down the back stairs, toward the administrative offices where he'd spent 23 years building a network of favor and silence. Elena had already forgotten he existed. The patient's blood pressure climbed. 90/55. 95/58. The kind of climb that meant he might live. She kept one hand on his shoulder while the residents under her instruction, because they were under her instruction now, everyone understood that, worked the trauma protocol like an orchestra following a conductor who hadn't conducted in 18 months but whose muscle memory was perfect. 22 minutes later, the patient was stabilized. Bleeding controlled. Conscious. Alive. Elena looked at General Kincaid. Looked at Tim Dawson. Looked at Dr. Hassan, who was crying quietly in the corner, finally understanding what he'd witnessed during the pile-up. The skill he'd seen wasn't just competence. It was training. Military training. The kind you only get if someone has sent you to places where keeping steady hands means keeping people alive. "I need to sit down," Elena said. Not because she was shaking. Because she could finally afford to, and the small human gesture felt like a luxury she'd been denied for 18 months. But before she could move, alarms started sounding from another direction. Not the trauma bay. The administrative corridor. The IT office, probably, given the way security was already moving that direction. What had happened was this: Marcus Webb, the hospital's IT administrator, a 58-year-old man who'd spent 6 years with the 160th SAW Night Stalkers as a weapons technician, had preserved every bite of security footage from the past 8 weeks. He'd watched Dr. Mercer rewrite Elena's charts in grand rounds. He'd watched him block her access during the mass casualty event. He'd watched him make phone calls to board members and state licensing officials. And Marcus, who had served with women like Elena in places where women like Elena had saved his life, had uploaded every frame to the State Medical Board, the hospital's board of directors, and 3 separate law firms specializing in medical malpractice and wrongful termination. Dr. Mercer had locked himself in his office on the 3rd floor, discovered his deletion commands were denied, watched his emails start exploding with notifications, and decided that running, actually leaving Colorado entirely, disappearing into whatever life a disgraced physician could salvage, was his only option. He'd made it as far as the parking lot before hospital security caught up with him. Elena didn't watch any of this. She didn't need to. She was sitting in the trauma bay, finally still, while General Kincaid told her 3 words at a time that everything was going to be different now. That her service was being acknowledged. That people were coming. 6 months later, on a day when Colorado Springs was bright with the kind of autumn light that makes you want to believe in new beginnings, Elena stood in the ER bay windows watching the parking lot fill with uniformed service members. They'd been arriving since dawn. Special Forces operators in green berets. Marines in dress blues. Army medics wearing the patches of units that had stood with her, fought alongside her, bled with her. Navy corpsmen. Air Force combat controllers. Helicopter pilots and explosive ordnance disposal specialists and communication sergeants and riflemen whose names she'd never known but whose lives were somehow woven into the architecture of hers. 200 service members. Maybe more. They filled the hospital lobby in a silent assembly that made the fluorescent light seem dim by comparison. General Kincaid stood at a podium that had been set up in front of the main elevators. In front of him, a velvet cushion. On the cushion, medals that had been waiting. Not in some filing cabinet. Not in some classified personnel file. Here. Visible. Real. Elena's credentials had been fully restored. Her apology from the hospital board was framed in her locker, though she'd moved the frame to a shelf where nobody would see it, because some things didn't need to be displayed. She was wearing fresh scrubs, the fabric moving against her skin with the kind of simple pleasure that unemployment had taught her to appreciate. Her daughter Sophia stood beside her, holding her hand, finally old enough to understand that Mommy's scars meant something. That the faded unit patch her mother had sewn into the lining of her jacket for 7 years wasn't decoration or sentiment. It was history. It was proof. The assembly came to attention. General Kincaid's voice carried through the lobby like a physical force. Captain Elena Martinez was denied this ceremony because her service was classified. Today, we correct that. Bronze Star. A pause. Reactions rippled through the assembly, hand-to-chest salutes, quiet nods. Purple Heart. Another pause, longer this time. Purple Heart again. The silence was so complete you could hear the rain starting on the windows outside, the same kind of rain that had fallen in Baghdad, that had fallen in her parking lot the night Mercer's phone calls had started, that had fallen on her kitchen table while her daughter asked why Mommy was home early. Navy commendation with Valor device. And a Navy cross. That one broke something open in the assembly. Sounds that weren't quite applause. Sounds that were older than applause. Sounds of recognition. General Kincaid pinned the medals to Elena's scrubs himself. His hands were steady. Hers were steady too. This was muscle memory at a different level, the acceptance of recognition without showing that recognition changed anything. She was still the same woman who'd worked night shifts and kept her head down and stitched her history into the lining of a jacket. Staff Sergeant Tim Dawson stepped forward, walking now without the cane, the physical therapy that had spanned 3 years finally resolving into something that looked like normalcy. He held out a flag, folded in the military way, precise and sacred. It was signed in dozens of hands, the medical unit she'd saved that day, the clinic staff who'd witnessed what she'd done, names she'd carried all these years without ever knowing who they belonged to. Sophia squeezed her mother's hand. "I didn't do it for recognition," Elena said when the general handed her the microphone. Her voice was steady, the kind of steady that comes from having already survived the worst thing. "I did it because it was right." She looked out at the sea of uniforms. Looked at Sophia. Looked at the empty parking space where Dr. Mercer's Mercedes used to sit, where a medical supply van now sat instead, the vehicle he drove to his new job, the only employment that would hire a physician stripped of his license for fraud. Look back at the assembly of soldiers and medics and operators who'd driven through the night to witness the moment when Captain Elena Martinez finally stopped being a ghost. General Kincaid's closing words echoed through the lobby like a benediction: "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." The assembly erupted in applause. Elena walked back toward the ER, Sophia holding one hand, Tim Dawson walking beside her. Ready for her shift. The medal she'd pinned to the inside of her jacket lining, against the faded unit patch, hidden the way she preferred them. Visible only to the people who needed to see them. Which meant visible to no one at all. But that was okay. She'd stopped needing anyone else to know. The ER doors slid open. The smell of antiseptic. The hiss of ventilators. The steady beep of monitors counting out heartbeats. The world of people who needed steady hands. Elena stepped into it like she was coming home. If you've been with us before, welcome back, hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here, please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.